Hi, this is Paula Gloria, and this show is called Farther Down the Rabbit Hole. For those of you who've been following the show this season and last season, you know that we've been starting often with interviews from people who are now stars on the movie What the Bleep Do We Know? And after these interviews, which have a lot of provocative information, we open up the show to you out there in TV land, the callers. And the call-ins that we've gotten have been something so heartening to indicate that indeed we can create a new reality. Today we have a very special guest with us. Mark Vicente is one of the producers of What the Bleep Do We Know? Welcome, Mark.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure to have you here and to have our viewers in Manhattan be exposed to the creative source of the movie. Can you say a bit of what got you to do this? What inspired you?
From the very, very beginning?
Just a thumbnail sketch.
About 5 years ago, William Arnst and I met. There's three of us that made this film, Will Arnst, myself, and Betsy Chassie, and we met about 5 years ago. And I was busy cutting another film, and Will was sort of looking over my shoulder, and he was saying, you know, I used to make movies when I was in college, and he looked over my shoulder and said, this looks like so much fun, let's talk about stuff.
And he's a software guy.
Yeah, he's a software guy. And he went to film school many, many years back. And so
just having a midlife crisis, wanting to get into a new
I'm
career.
not really sure what it was, you know, but Will actually ended up doing software for quite a while, and, you know, had made some good money. And so he saw what I was doing and said, you know, let's talk about some ideas. And so he said to me, you know, I've always wanted to make this movie about science. I'd like people to get a good look at science and sort of the mysticism as well. And I said, that's funny, because I've always wanted to make like an animated film about quantum mechanics and quantum physics and how that...
You did?
Yeah, and how that may relate to mysticism as well.
Ah.
So we thought, well, let's figure out what to do. So we sat down and we said, okay, we'll make a documentary. And we started, Will decided, well, I'm going to put up like $250,000 to make this documentary. And we started, Will actually did the first draft of the script, and we started discussing what this would be. And then we brought Betsy on board, at which point she said, well, I think it's really wonderful, boys, but I don't understand what you're talking about. And if I don't understand, nobody's going to understand. So we started reevaluating, okay, how do we make a film that is understandable to everybody, not just two geeks? And so we went on this much longer journey and a much bigger budget.
Spiritual club.
We were. We basically we met there, doing the same spiritual work, and then Betsy came on board later.
So she was like a barometer of.
Yeah, she was like, "What are you guys talking about?" So she came and she said, "Well, let me just look at the spiritual work you're doing, so I get an idea of what you're talking about." But she kept on saying, "If you can't explain it to me, nobody will understand it." So she was an amazing, like you say, barometer for making sure that we wouldn't just get in our heads and not be able to translate these ideas.
Right. And so then, when was the next challenge? Because I think at one point you had to decide.
When wasn't the next challenge? There were a bunch of challenges.
When was the movie named, for example? Because it seems
when was it actually made?
When was the next? When weren't there challenges? What the Bleep Do We Know seems to be something that could be said for challenges.
Yeah.
Right?
Here's the thing: we really were like Will and I especially were convinced that we sort of knew what we were doing, and we thought we knew what was going on. We thought we understood this all, and in the process of we wrote about I think about 20 or 22 versions of the screenplay, which was, you know, interviews and all kinds of things, which we had made up at that point, because we read all these books, and we thought we knew what everybody was going to say. And we sort of started to realize that maybe things weren't quite working. And so Betsy said, you know, why don't we go and interview these people and, you know, sort of see what they're going to say and see if that helps inspire us as to where to go next, which we did. And every time we sat down and interviewed somebody, they would often go much, much further than what they'd written. And so we'd say, well, that's not in your book.
They'd written or you'd written?
Well, they'd written. Because we had read their books and then figured out, all right, well, this makes sense here. And so we started to take some of those excerpts to make sense of what it is we wanted to do. And we'd say to them, you know, well, this we don't recall this being in your book. Oh, that's old now. This is where I'm headed now. So every time we interviewed somebody, we're like, oh, there's all this new information that we'd never considered before. By the time we finished interviewing all these people, we were like, oh my God, now what do we do? So what we did is start basically, we cut, it was about, I think 60 or 70 hours of material that we cut down into 6 hours and then 3 hours and then an hour and a half, and then started saying, all right, now how do we take a narrative story and run it through? And the reason it was important is because we didn't think people could just watch talking heads. You know, we figured that they'd be asleep in like 20 minutes. And everyone in
the industry said you can't.
And everybody said you can't do that. But what we figured is, all right, what we'll do is we'll weave a narrative story throughout this. And we'll also use cartoon animation and sort of computer graphic animation to tell the story as well, so that we could keep people entertained and keep them engaged in what we were saying and awake. Because you know, one of the things about America specifically is we don't have a big attention span.
Yeah.
You know, commercials, everything's fast, everything moves fast, cuts fast, etc.
Right, and that was the value of the spiritual school, to sustain a long thought. But how do you, when you're in the media, take an audience that doesn't know how to sustain a long thought and grab their attention long enough to inspire them to cultivate themselves, to think a longer thought?
Well, I think the thing you have to do is make sure that they have a feeling to hang it on. So that's why a story is sometimes so important. That's why I think a lot of great teachers, you know, through thousands of years would tell stories, would tell parables, because you can't necessarily walk up to somebody and say, listen, this is what you need to address. What you might do is tell them a story about something, and then see if they recognize the relevance of that story to them, so that they can sort of metaphorically start to get what you're saying and say, oh, I know what you mean. I understand that.
Would you say that this film became another teacher for you, so that you could understand things that you didn't before? Because we were speaking before we started to shoot this on, I would say, a very important turning point in your life that happened a year and a half ago. Can you relate it at all?
It did. You see, the thing is, I was a theoretician. You know, I mean, I'm not a scientist. I'm a filmmaker. That's what I've always done. But I loved science, and I read voraciously, and I took in knowledge voraciously, but theoretically. And sometimes I thought, well, this is great. I don't really know if I want to apply this in my life, but it's really wonderful. I never wanted to really apply things as clearly as I did once I started making the film, because I started recognizing that the way to actually change wasn't just to take the knowledge in. You had to do something with it. And I think that during the process of making this film and studying all these concepts so carefully, it's one thing to read it in a book, and it's one thing to listen to somebody else say it. But when you start designing animated sequences in your mind of the best way to explain an idea, you start to have these very real emotional and visceral experiences with that information that are longer lasting, that somehow get into long-term memory, and it literally changes you. Like, who said that? Was it Joey said, from the inside out? The knowledge actually starts to permeate right inside you.
You allowed that to happen. You cared so much about the success of being able to make a contribution.
I cared so much about getting the ideas out. I was telling you that this journey sort of started when I was like 6 years old, and I grew up in South Africa, you know, in a very a somewhat privileged Afrikaans household, and you know, my family.
Speak Afrikaans?
I do.
Wow.
And my family were somewhat racist.
Yeah.
And
so you realized, I'm from a racist family. What do I do about it?
I knew that pretty young, that there was something not right.
Wow.
And I had a really amazing experience when I was 6. I went to see a musical. It was a musical called Ipitombi, and it was Zulu dancing and drumming. And I remember being so moved by the experience of seeing it. There was something about the music and something about the dancing, and I was so moved that I wanted to keep on listening to the music. And so my mom bought me the cassette. And I went home, and we had these cake tins that you used to get cakes in, and I turned them all over, and I used to like bang on these cake tins while listening to the music.
Wow.
And I remember we lived in the bush, in like the middle of nowhere, and we lived between 2 mountain ranges, or I should say hills. They weren't really mountains. And I had this incredible feeling as I was doing that, and I sort of recognized that if other people felt this feeling that I was feeling inside me right now, maybe they wouldn't want to hurt each other so much. You know, maybe they wouldn't want to kill each other, and maybe they wouldn't want to say mean things, and all the things that I was starting to see in the world, especially in relation to racism and the way that I felt that white people were treating black people. So
a lot of white people don't open themselves up to that music.
No, I don't know what the deal was with me. I just liked it. I just liked it. I just liked the music, and I had, you know, I don't actually know the reason. I just liked it.
But music is a spiritual inspiration to different cultures, and
it is.
To acquire the taste, to appreciate a different music, it's an acquired taste.
It is. I guess I just acquired the taste for some reason.
It's wonderful. So let continue.
Well, what happened was that I imagined, like, if I could get other people to feel this, the world would be different. And so I thought to myself, well, if I had a speaker system that was really, really big, that was so big that I could get this sound out. Now bear in mind, as a 6-year-old, I thought the sound I was making was beautiful. I'm sure it wasn't, but it certainly made me feel very good. And I thought if I could have a speaker system that was big enough, and other people could hear it, that they would feel this feeling, and that they would also feel differently. And I thought about this a lot as a kid, you know, where could I find speakers and how big could they be and how much, and I didn't think about cost at that point because that didn't enter my mind.
6 years old.
And then when I was 13, I saw Star Wars. I was in Lisbon with my parents and I saw Star Wars and I just remember that I couldn't speak afterwards. My mother and father were like, you know, wondering what was going on with me, and I couldn't speak because as I suddenly had this realization, that's the speaker system.
Oh, in the movies.
That's what I was looking for.
Wow.
And so it became this passion, like from 13 on, I said, all right, I'm going to learn everything I can about making movies. And I decided then that's what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, is I'm going to make movies.
Right.
Because I figured if I could find a way to get some of the ideas or some of the feelings that I felt out to the world in some way, that maybe people would start thinking about them. Not that I thought that it was necessarily a better way, I just thought that for me it was a way that I thought was good for me. And I thought, well, maybe some other people might find it valuable as well. So that became an obsession of mine, you know, and I went through drama school and I went through film school, you know, and I worked my way up through the ranks, you know, in the film industry with the idea that one day I would find a way to get some of those ideas out. So, and what the Bleep is like for me, the first really great step to what it is that I want to do.
Now, at what point did you gather spiritual teachings?
You know, that started pretty young too. I was doing.
Just give a rundown, because on this show, that's what I study, different spiritual traditions.
I started with. I kept on asking my mom, like there was something I was looking for. So my mom would get me books on like kung fu, and I said, no, that's not it. Then she gave me a book on karate. I said, that's not it. And then she gave me a book on yoga. I said, that's sort of it, but not quite it. And then, you know, got involved in Hinduism, got involved in Buddhism.
How did you get involved in Hinduism? Like
well,
transcendental meditation?
Yeah, I had there was a guru when I lived in Canada that I was seeing when I was like 12. I sort of started, you know, yoga and
a mantra meditation?
Hinduism. No, I don't recall that we did mantra meditations. It was mostly
yoga,
it was body postures, and then just, you know, going into this very, very still place inside, and that's when I started to learn.
Were you then?
That was 12.
12?
Yeah,
that's
that was
very
12.
Precocious.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
It was. And then I rebelled against all of that. You know, when I was like 14, I decided, or 15, I just rebelled against all of that. And then...
Religion's the opiate of the people?
Yeah, I just was like, you know, none of this works for me.
Right.
You know, and then I sort of took another look at Christianity, and then I took, you know, a look at the New Age, and none of those things really worked for me until I found science. Because science, for some reason, started making sense to me. Not the classical science that people talk about, you know, balls rolling and hitting each other, but there was something really magnificent about science that I found intoxicating, because it started talking about possibilities that sounded to me like what the mystics had been talking about for thousands of years.
Right.
And I started to wonder if there's a connection. And so I started when I was a teenager, probably like 17 or 18, I started reading science and reading like fantasy and reading like scientific, like Arthur C. Clarke and stuff like that, just absorbing as much as I could, because I had a feeling there was something to it that I couldn't understand, but that I felt could be a contribution to humankind in some way. Because I had this idea that if we understood the world in a better way, and if we understood ourselves in a better way, that we may be able to understand how all of this works.
And we would sustain our existence long enough to go to another level.
That would be good.
You know, I mean, oftentimes people say it's fantasy to think that through spiritual endeavor you can stop wars, that the spiritual people have their heads in the sand. They're not really aware of what's going on. But
it depends on the people. I think that indeed some people do have their head in the sand, and I think there are some people that are aware that it doesn't take. Are there 6 billion people on the planet right now? I don't know that it takes 6 billion people to become enlightened to create a change. I do think there is a critical number. It does take, though, to have a certain level of understanding that will affect the world. I'm not sure if it's 1 or 1 billion. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know that it's 6 billion, because that seems like a tough task.
Yeah, but continue on what you were saying about the intellectual information you were gathering, or you were so attracted to science, and yet in our conversation before you said yet there was still another step.
There was. You know, I'd been doing a lot of spiritual practices for years and years and years, and I'd heard a lot of things, and a lot of the teachers I'd had said the same things again and again and again, but it was only when I started working on the film and thinking really deeply about some of these things and having the experience, everything in the film in regards to the whole section on emotional addictions. I mean, we wrote all that stuff based on the fact that we were all experiencing that stuff.
Right.
you know, as
Particularly making the
filmmakers.
film.
Yeah, as filmmakers. I mean, you know, we'd have flare-ups about this, and then my ego would get involved, and then I'd behave like a prima donna, and Will would behave one way, and Betsy would behave another way, and you know, it was all this stuff going on, and so we developed.
Humbling, isn't it?
It's very humbling. We developed a lot of these ideas.
I have to learn what I'm trying to teach.
Yeah, yeah. And if you're not willing to explore it, you know, you can't really make a movie about it.
Exactly.
So in exploring it, I got to have a really real sense of like who I was and how I behaved and how I got in my own way.
As opposed to when you were in all those spiritual practices before, you could avoid it because you were never put to the test?
Well, you see, the thing is, you can be put to the test and actually not be in your body. One of the difficulties about certain spiritual practices, if you spend all your time trying to get out of your body, you never really get to test how you do as a human being.
Or in other words, the connection that this body has to its contribution that the soul wants to make.
Right. Well,
that for you was being a producer for what the Bleep.
Well, we live in a body.
That puts you in your body.
Well, we live in a body, and we interact with other people. And I found that certain practices I did was all about getting out of the body. And so the problem that's tough sometimes is you can live in complete denial because you're so busy focused on, well, I just want to be this, I want to be this, and I want to be this. And then you get back in your body and have this tremendous sense of like heaviness.
Right.
And then want to, oh, if I could only,
because it's not,
and I've got to be here, I have to be up here. So now what happens is you can do that, you spend all your time up here and never actually deal with the beauty of what it is to be human.
Right.
It's a beautiful experience. It's magnificent. And a lot of people, and myself included, have spent a lot of time trying to get away from it. And I'm not entirely certain that this thing called enlightenment is something that you do outside of your body, because it doesn't make sense then that we would be born in a body. It may be something that occurs in a body.
Oh, yeah, right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
That's kind of what I started to understand.
So now explain too about how this relates very practically to people who don't care about spiritual practice, who have never been interested or have done it and been disappointed. What's a practical application in your own case? Because I've had an experience in my case when I was traveling to Kashmir, where when the Abu Ghraib prison information and photos were coming out, I was in an entirely Muslim community, and at one point when I mentioned American leadership, particularly our president, I could see the people had no desire for me to dislike my president at all. They just wanted to be heard, and they wanted the American people to help with their power to assist a course of action that would help them have an easier life. And when I saw that was, for me, was a revelation. And we were speaking before. Could you address what you were telling me?
Yeah. I was telling you that I, about a year and a half ago, I had this real sense of anger about the president and about the leadership of this country and about the way certain things were happening in this country, and sort of the way I felt that the fundamental right were running the country in a certain direction. And
they weren't meeting your needs.
Well, basically, they were doing it a certain way, and I thought I had a better way, which may not be true at all.
Right.
It's just my opinion. But one of the things that I started to understand, and in the new film, we interview Dean Radin, who talks about human entanglement, the way we're entangled together, and I can talk about that after this. And I recognized that every single thought I have about somebody else, they register that thought on some level. And I started to think about, when I am angry at somebody, or when I, for instance, had a feeling of hatred towards the president, what does that do? Does that actually make the situation better? And I started to recognize, well, how could it? Because I'm angry or I'm hateful towards somebody. And that doesn't necessarily make them feel any better.
Right.
And I thought somehow that the solution to dealing with tyranny was to be angry at it. And then started to recognize, well, that's tyranny.
Right?
Yeah.
Anger.
Oh, yeah.
Somehow you're
Indignation.
more on the side of the oppressed and the poor. You're putting your vote in that you're against what's making them suffer, and yet you're not doing anything to make them suffer.
One can still do all of those things, but it doesn't have to be done in a very, very angry way. And I think that, I was telling you, I had a conversation with somebody who said to me one day, he said, well, how does that help? And I said, well, you have to say something. And he said to me, well, indeed, you do have to say something if that's if your sort of moral and ethical stance. But how do you think being angry at a group of people who use tyranny to get what they want helps? And I realized it didn't. I think it's more valuable for me now, this is what I'm really loving, to see where is it that I have a reaction. And then once I look at the thing I'm reacting to, how is it that I've behaved that way or I'm still behaving that way?
Right.
We find it, I find it, and a few people I know find it very easy to blame so many other people and conditions in the world. But the question is, well, why are we reacting at all? Why is it so upsetting? Is it because it's unjust? Perhaps it is unjust. But when we have a reaction and we want to take somebody else down because of that, very often it's really about ourselves. Very often there's something there that bugs us about ourselves.
Right, right. Even Miha Ledwith said that in the case of religion, my religion can only be right if yours is wrong. So we're talking about a whole paradigm change.
Mm-hmm. I just don't think it works to tell other people that they're wrong.
Yeah.
I think it's more interesting and more effective to explore ideas. One of the things that was amazing after that, when we started to release the first What the Bleep, we were at a screening in Seattle, and a few people came up to me and Betsy, and one person said, you know, well, I'm Baha'i, and this person was a black Muslim, and this person was a Christian Scientist. And all three of them stood in front of us, and they said, you know, this is great, because this is like what we believe in, this is what we think. And we were like, really? They said, yeah. And we were like, you're kidding. Yeah. I had no idea. I mean, and I don't think Betsy did either. And we suddenly saw all these people coming together of different denominations. At the end of screenings, all these people of different denominations would sit and talk to each other. Right. And we thought, oh my God, that's incredible. We had no idea that was going to happen. Right. It was a huge surprise, but wonderful. I mean, imagine that happening globally. People recognizing it's not just about a religion.
Some people have said that your movie, although it says we create our reality, I'm going to be the super devil's advocate here.
Super.
That there's not really, the science doesn't really say that we create our reality. And yet, there's something that hooks people and it inspires people, it resonates with something inside them that when they're thinking nice thoughts, nice things happen, or when they're feeling more clear, things are more in order. How does somebody watching this, who's inspired, who says, I shouldn't be angry at things happening, not repress their anger? What do they actually do about it? I mean, in What the Bleep Do We Know, what I remember, Joe Dispenza seemed to take me with him when he talked about creating his day in terms of giving a process. What would you suggest on a practical level?
Well, the problem with suppressing your anger is it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
I'm just assuming, I mean, I was just
as an example.
I'd like to be like Mark Vicente.
Oh no, Mark Vicente has, he's all kinds of things that go on inside him. I think the greatest and most important thing to do is to look at it and recognize it. I think until we actually identify it, we can't do anything about it. Because once we actually look at it, once we are able to actually have the experience of stepping outside of ourselves and watch ourselves, once we have that, we can start to see the way we behave in some remarkable, remarkable ways. And I feel in that moment you start to have choices you don't have. When you're like in the experience of being angry, of being all those things, it's very difficult to realize that you actually have a choice. You kind of forget that you were the one that just generated that feeling. Because you think somebody else just generated that feeling. So when you have the experience, when you start to contemplate, you know, yourself as a human being, and all these questions you start to ask, and you start to have the sense of pulling away and watching yourself. And watching, well, who is this person, Mark, and why does he behave the way he does, and why does he do the things he does, and why is he afraid of this, and why is he angry at that, and why is he, you know, insecure in this area? You start to look at that. You start to have a sense of yourself from a different perspective, and you realize, you know, I'm this person, this thing inside this body behaving in these ways. I wonder. You start to realize, I think I have a choice. You start to recognize a choice that you didn't have before. That's the greatest thing, and that's where I think the pivotal moment where it begins, because when you're just doing the thing, you have no idea. Once that drama is over, and you're like all flushed, and you know you've just had the anger attack or the insecurity attack or the fear attack or whatever it is, you're like, oh man, I did it again. You know?
How can spiritual leadership help at that point? Say, for example, at the Ramtha school, how did his presence in your life help?
I think that great spiritual leaders are people, they're like personal coaches. You know, like, for instance, you run a marathon, you're an Olympic athlete, you have a coach. Right. And what that coach does is that coach has a perspective outside of yourself. That coach can see what you're doing. Say, you know what, I don't know if you know this, but you're putting your foot down in a certain way there. I don't think that's actually helping you with your objective.
Right.
The thing to do is, of course, to find out, well, what is their objective? Yeah. If their objective is to do better, then a great teacher, like a great coach, says, well, here's what I'm seeing from the outside, and here's some information that you may not have considered. I think that's the value of having a teacher.
And they probably have a wider perspective.
You know, I certainly have found that the teachers in my life have always had a wider perspective than I've had.
Right. Yet when you were 6 years old, you had a sense that you were in a racist family. That to me seems pretty huge, because that again is being
well, it was
difficult
it was
to see.
but it was great what happened. You see, what happened was that I was going to church with my grandfather, and it was a very, very Calvinistic, repressive church, in my opinion. And the person that did the garden, now I was a little white boy, 6 years old, and the person that did the garden was a 50-year-old man who I called a boy, because that was the way, you know, you were raised. You called him the boy. And I asked him one day why there were no black people in church, and he said to me, because they don't want us there. So I had this piece of information as a child. They don't want us there. Okay, so I go to my grandfather and I say, you know, I was wondering why you don't want black people to be in the church. And he said, we do. And the next time I went to church, I went to ask the priest, and I said, do you allow black people in church? And he said, no. So I had all these like conflicting opinions, and I suddenly realized there's something wrong. See, kids are amazing. We're trying to like figure things out and put things together.
Right.
If I didn't have that happen, I don't know how long it would have taken me to have a realization something's not right.
Yeah.
And I also wondered, well, why do these two white people treat each other with a certain level of respect, and then this person goes and treats this black person differently? Well, why do they do that? Because, you know, kids are kind of like, you know, colorblind and sex blind, you know, before we hit puberty and get a little weird. You know, there's a certain blindness that's wonderful at that age. And I couldn't figure out why people behave differently, why you respected this person, you denigrated that person.
Right.
Those were really valuable experiences. I am so thrilled that I was born in a country where tyranny and oppression was so blatantly clear.